My sons packed their entire Miami life into garbage bags on a Thursday afternoon, 18 hours before their lease officially terminated, because the moving company they called couldn't get a truck out fast enough once the eviction notice arrived. I found this out from a text message with 3 photos attached, no explanation, just images of black plastic bags stacked in a hallway that had cost more per month than I paid for my own house. I looked at those photos for a long time before I answered. Then I wrote back one sentence, told them I hoped the drive home was safe, and went back to reading the revised terms of my will. Before I explain how we got from a panicked flight to Miami to 3 garbage bags in a hallway, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications, because you'll want to see exactly what happens when the person quietly holding everything up finally lets go. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been told your help was suffocating by someone who had no idea how much of their life depended on it? Welcome to Revenge Stories Narrated, where family betrayal meets inevitable justice and karma always collects its debt. My name is Miriam. I'm 63, a widow, and I spent 35 years building a regional hardware supply company from a single storefront into something that eventually let me retire comfortably and help my 2 sons, Dominic and Raphael, in ways I genuinely believed for a long time were simply what a good mother did. When they moved to Miami 4 years ago, chasing careers in finance and real estate development, I co-signed the lease on a high-rise apartment neither of them could have qualified for on their own, and 2 years later, I put up personal collateral to secure a business line of credit for a venture Dominic launched with Raphael as his partner, a company that never quite turned the profit either of them promised me it eventually would. I never asked for anything in return beyond the occasional phone call, and even that over the past 2 years had become something I found myself scheduling around rather than something they simply offered. Dominic, in particular, had developed a habit of describing my involvement to his friends as his mother believing in his vision, a phrase that always struck me as doing a great deal of work to avoid the word co-signing. Raphael was quieter about it, but no less comfortable living inside a lifestyle that, on his own income, he couldn't have sustained for more than a few months. There had been smaller moments over those 4 years that I'd let pass without much comment, the way you let things pass when the alternative feels like picking a fight you're not sure you'll win. A birthday dinner where Dominic mentioned, casually, that he'd told a colleague his family had simply always had money, a phrasing that erased 35 years of my own long hours behind a hardware counter in a single sentence. A holiday visit where Raphael corrected me, gently but firmly, when I referred to their apartment as something I was helping with, insisting instead that they'd worked hard to get where they were, a claim I found difficult to reconcile with the credit check I'd personally co-signed 2 years earlier. 3 days before their engagement party, an event I only learned about through a group photo posted online rather than an actual invitation, both of my sons stopped answering my calls entirely. I assumed, reasonably I thought at the time, that something serious had happened, an accident, an illness, something urgent enough to explain 3 consecutive days of silence from 2 young men who otherwise texted me sporadic requests for advice, or, more often lately, money. I booked a flight to Miami that same afternoon, drove straight from the airport to their building, and arrived to find not an emergency, but a lavish engagement party already well underway on their rooftop terrace, string lights, a full bar, 40 guests I mostly didn't recognize, celebrating Dominic's engagement to a woman named Odile I'd met exactly once before that night. I found my sons near the bar, and my relief at seeing them unharmed lasted about as long as it took Dominic to notice me standing there in travel clothes, clearly out of place among guests dressed for a party I hadn't been told existed. He didn't ask why I'd flown down. He asked, in front of several of his guests, why I'd come at all, and when I explained, honestly, that I'd been worried after 3 days without a word, Raphael said, loudly enough for the small circle around us to hear clearly, that my constant checking in had become suffocating, that they were grown men who didn't need their mother showing up unannounced, and that maybe it was time I learned to stay in my own lane. Odile laughed, not unkindly exactly, more the reflexive laugh of someone who didn't fully understand the weight of what had just been said, and a few of the guests near us laughed too, the way people laugh at a joke they assume is affectionate because the tone suggested it should be. I stood there for a long moment in my travel clothes at a party celebrating a life I had personally financed the framework for, and felt something in my chest go very quiet, not angry exactly, more like the specific stillness of finally seeing something clearly that I'd spent years choosing not to look at directly. If you've ever flown somewhere in a genuine panic only to find out the people you were worried about were simply too busy enjoying themselves to answer a phone, hit like right now. I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever been told your care was too much by someone who had no idea what that care was actually holding up. I didn't make a scene. I told them I understood, congratulated Dominic and Odile on the engagement, and left the party within 20 minutes of arriving, driving to a hotel rather than the guest room they'd occasionally offered when it suited them. I flew home the next morning and called my attorney, a careful, patient man named Otto who had handled my affairs for over a decade, and asked him, plainly, to begin the formal process of withdrawing my guarantor status on both the apartment lease and the business line of credit, effective as quickly as the underlying agreements legally allowed. What my sons never fully understood, because neither of them had ever bothered to read the actual terms of the agreements I'd signed on their behalf, was that my signature wasn't a formality. It was the entire structural basis for both arrangements. The luxury building's lease required a qualifying guarantor given their combined income relative to the rent, a requirement I satisfied and neither of them independently could. The business credit line was secured entirely against my personal collateral, not theirs, since the venture itself had never generated enough revenue or assets to secure financing on its own merits. Remove my name from either agreement and both structures didn't weaken. They collapsed. Otto filed the formal withdrawal notices the following week, timed, deliberately on my part, to land just before the building's annual lease renewal deadline and the credit line's quarterly compliance review. Within 48 hours of the notices taking effect, the building's management issued a non-compliance notice triggering an accelerated eviction timeline, since the lease's qualifying terms were no longer met. The bank, separately, froze the business line of credit pending a full collateral review, a process that effectively halted the company's operating accounts entirely while it played out. I found out most of what happened next the same way I'd found out about the engagement party, secondhand, through photos and brief messages rather than actual phone calls. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. The frozen accounts meant Dominic and Raphael couldn't cover the security deposit or first month's rent on anything comparable, and neither could afford a lawyer capable of untangling either situation quickly enough to matter. They rented a moving truck themselves, packed what they could into it and the rest into garbage bags, and drove 18 hours back to the town they'd left 4 years earlier, arriving with considerably less than they'd left with and no clear plan for what came next. I didn't rescue them from any of it, though every instinct I'd spent decades acting on told me to. I let the process play out exactly as the paperwork required, the same paperwork they'd never bothered reading closely enough to understand how much it had always depended on me. I also spent that same week with Otto rewriting my will, a document that had, until then, left the bulk of my estate to Dominic and Raphael in equal shares. The revised version directs the majority of it to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, a cause that had mattered to me quietly for years and that I'd never gotten around to formalizing while I was still busy holding up 2 lives that had stopped making room for me in them. They're both back home now, working ordinary jobs, living considerably smaller lives than the ones I used to help finance without ever being thanked for it. Raphael found work at a warehouse a few towns over, the same kind of physical, unglamorous labor I'd started out doing myself decades earlier, a detail neither of us has directly commented on, but that I suspect we're both thinking about more than we say. Dominic called last month, the first real conversation we've had in nearly a year, and it was careful and a little stilted, the kind of conversation two people have when they're both trying to figure out how much honesty the relationship can currently hold. I didn't bring up the party. I didn't bring up the will either. I told him I was glad to hear from him because I was, and because loving someone and continuing to structurally enable them turned out, eventually, to be 2 very different things, and I'm no longer willing to confuse the two. If you've ever quietly stopped holding up something that was never grateful for the weight you were carrying, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next.